Right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to get us started because my brief is that we have very, very limited time for our session. So could I please ask everyone to take their seats so we can start in just a few seconds. Right, photograph is done, so we will get going. Thank you all very much for joining us for this afternoon's sessions. My brief as chair was to say as little as possible, so as to allow time for our three esteemed speakers' papers, and of course we have in front of us really the stars of Holocaust scholarship, or some of them in this country, and I will introduce each of them very briefly again because you have the bios in your packs. Our first speaker is Dr. Andrea Hammel. She's reader in the Modern Languages Department and director of the Center for the Movement of People at Aberystwyth University. And she will be talking to us about the use of testimony in writing refugee history. Andrea.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I feel very honored to speak to you today. In my abstract, which some of you, if you use the QR code, you can find, I quoted the esteemed German historian Wolfgang Benz, who in the late 1990s claimed that the eyewitness is the enemy of the historian. Now, of course, he did say this to be provocative, but obviously there was also certain frustration coming out there. And we all know eyewitnesses can misremember details, and that could potentially be frustrating to a historian, because the tension between the veracity and the authenticity of testimony is something that has been discussed for a long time and is still being discussed. However, any writing, any narrative, any witnessing is always mediated. And any testimony is mediated through the language it was taken in, the circumstances, the way it was recorded, and this is something I will speak about later. Now, we've already heard this morning what is testimony. Of course, testimony is first and foremost a legal term, and this is where what we're discussing here is possibly derived from. But testimony really is how to translate experience into words. Now, I know this is not an academic conference, but the academic landscape, as I'm sure some of you will know, is changing. What was maybe more secluded, critically some people would say was an ivory tower and everybody just did things for each other. We wrote academic papers for each other. This is certainly not something that is being encouraged by modern universities today. So the academic landscape is changing, and generally history writing is now done for a more general audience, because the impact outside academia is more and more important. Now, I might have to sort of give a little sort of warning there. I am reader in modern languages, not a historian, so I'm actually sort of here under false pretenses anyway. But life stories, testimony, and reflexive writing, writing about yourself, autobiographical writing, is used now to make history engaging for the wider audience. And maybe there is a different history writing. People like stories. When I try, I'm glad you're nodding, yes, and people like stories. And when I sort of discuss projects with, for example, publishers or funders, there's often this, oh yeah, we really liked that story. So what I've recently been working on is a project on refugees from National Socialism in Wales. The project's called Refugees from National Socialism in Wales, Learning from the Past for the Future. And this project was part of the IWM-led Holocaust, Second World War and Holocaust Partnership Program, and it was funded by the National Heritage Lottery Fund. And one of our major outcomes was an exhibition, and in that middle picture here you see myself and the local MP, but much more important, you see Renate Collins, who is somewhere here in the room as well, who came to the opening of this exhibition. Renate fled as a 5-year-old from Prague to South Wales on a Kindertransport. And here again, we found that what people find fascinating about this exhibition is the stories. Everybody wants to follow through the exhibition of the different stories of the different refugees who fled to Wales. Now, this exhibition was conceived originally just for Aberystwyth University. There's an art center at the University Aberystwyth Art Center, but it has been much more successful than we ever imagined. It's currently on its last day in Cardiff at the Senedd, at the Welsh Parliament, and it is also going to go to North Wales, to Bangor University. But most surprisingly, through the local MP, he encouraged us to invite, to apply for it to go to the Palace of Westminster. So next, it's actually going to come quite close here. It's going to be in the upper waiting gallery of the Palace of Westminster. So this is, of course, quite a coup, as my local MP said. And I think if you come from Aberystwyth University, you think, well, you've made it to the center now, and the margin wide west of Wales now to the center. But what am I trying to say here? And that is that for this exhibition and for the book I wrote on the subject, I used quite a lot of oral and video testimony from the IWM, from the British Library, from the National Library of Wales, which happens to be in Aberystwyth, but also from the AGR Refugee Voices for Testimony Archive. So this is really important to me, and that I use these testimonies. I very rarely collect testimonies myself or interview people, although I did with Renate, who's here, I did actually interview her, and again, we used this for the project. I don't say this, that I don't interview so much to be sort of facetious or something. It is mainly because I feel, and Bea this morning mentioned this, there's so much testimony out there that I, as a researcher, should actually use it, analyze it, examine it, use it in my writing. So why does everybody like stories so much? Now, part of this is that what we haven't discussed much is the aspect of self-reflexivity, giving testimony, people talking about, writing about their own lives. They also often find out things about themselves. And I think Sarah also talked about testimony as a communicative genre. It is often a communication between the interviewer and the interviewee. But, as I said, it is incredibly positive. I've recently had this feedback, which is now on the screen, from a woman who apparently read my book, and she's a woman completely unconnected to the subject. She's someone my son plays basketball with. So it's completely, but she wrote me a text, and she said that she liked the book, and she said, "It is hard needed to share the stories of real people and make immigrants human again." Now, of course, all of us here in this room, we all know this. We know that immigrants are human. But it reminded me of a sort of different narrative, obviously, that is out in the public. And that is something that she felt it was important to write against. And obviously, this is also what I feel. And I think examining oral testimony, examining these stories is one important way of doing it. Now, very interestingly, we already had some discussion about veracity and authenticity this morning. And of course, the first thing that strikes you with this picture is, this wasn't really what I wanted to talk about first, but I chose this picture, and it's the picture of a pope who was wearing this unusual coat, this white puffer jacket. And this picture was all over the media, and this picture, of course, is a deep fake. The pope did not wear such a jacket. Someone created this with artificial intelligence, with AI. But why is this so grappling? And why is this the first thing everybody saw when you looked at my slide? And I think this is because we are becoming a culture that's very keen on visuals, that's actually obsessed with visuals much more than with words. And most people here are maybe of a slightly older generation, but I mean, certainly our children, they are immersed in videos. And Bea mentioned this is obviously an interesting point. What can we do about video testimony? So we're obsessed with visual experience, but what about it? You know, people think visual, if you have a video testimony, it's maybe even more authentic than just reading or reading something, or maybe have an oral testimony. On the other hand, we now know this is possible. Anything can be done with a video as well. On the other hand, history writing is now much more willing to include emotion, and emotion is clearly something that you can mainly get from testimony. Of course, we want a certain identification with the victim, but then maybe we don't want too much identification. We already had the question earlier about fictionalization and other people using testimony that is not their own. How far can you go? And if you go down that line, what about secondary witnessing? People that read something and then reproduce or use it as their own testimony. And what about post-memory? What about the second generation, people who have not themselves experienced the Holocaust and who not themselves were refugees, but whose ancestors or parents were? So these are all questions we need to discuss, and I think we will discuss more and more in the next few years as we are coming to this post-witness age. So to give a very precise example, as I said, I've used, for my writing, I've used testimony from the Imperial War Museum, from the National Library of Wales, from British Library, but also from Refugee Voices. And those of you who know me, I have also done quite a bit of research on the Kindertransport, and I've just written a book on the Kindertransport. And to give you a more precise example, I've actually chosen an interview from Refugee Voices, the interview with Ari Handler, who was also in the film. This is pure accident. We haven't coordinated this, but it's working out very well. This is an interview conducted by Bea Lefkowitz with Ari Handler on the 9th of July 2003, so relatively at the beginning of this of the Refugee Voices project. And interestingly, the Kindertransport, as you know, the last time I spoke to this in this wonderful room was the Kindertransport, is a very contentious subject. And there is a lot of testimony on the Kindertransport, and some people have criticized some of the testimony as being maybe too positive, too celebratory, glossing over the difficulties. And we've discussed this at the last conference, and I'm sure we will continue to discuss this as well. And of course, just by the chronological age, the child refugees, the Kindertransport refugees are those who are still alive, and those people who organize the Kindertransport, of course, tend to not be with us anymore, and this makes it difficult. So Ari Handler, he was an organizer. He was a young man himself, but he was an organizer of Hachshrot. He was a Zionist leader, and he was the organizer of one of the biggest Hachshrah in Britain, and that was actually in North Wales. It was in Gwych Castle in Aberystwyth in North Wales, and about 200 teenage refugees found sanctuary there at this castle, and they all came, or mainly, almost all came via the Kindertransport scheme. And most of them also remember their experience at the castle as very positive, and there's some sort of other diverse voices who say that the castle was incredibly dilapidated, that the sanitary conditions were awful, and there wasn't enough adult supervision. But when asked by Bea about his experience and what he was doing, he said the following. Now, this is on the screen, but this is small. I'm going to read this. My job was to get visas for young people to come to England for the time being. Because it was not I was not the person who could do much about the bigger issues. My job was simply to help us getting visas for young people to come first of all to this country, and we would then later take them to Palestine, if we can. I must say we were successful. We, as you know, places that we established, that was the one part of my most important work, which I did when I came in 1938, and even before. We persuaded Lord Balfour to give us his estate in Whittingham in Scotland. There's also Whittingham somewhere in Sussex. But that was a big farm where both religious and non-religious boys and girls were placed. In fact, Henny's sister, who is still alive, thank God, who was there, one of the ones who founded the Kibbutz Lavi. She is still there. We had 200 boys and girls, both religious and non-religious, in West Scotland, and we had another castle where we got married. I'll show you a picture of it. Gwych Castle in North Wales. We managed to get 200 boys and girls. I mean, that was the work which we did. They called it the Kindertransport, Narrischkeiten, that's Yiddish for silliness. It was never called. We simply got visas for people, and that's where we had trouble, or I had trouble with the community. I mean, you don't hear today when you read the AJR things. So as you can see, my talk is full of slightly provocative statements. Ari Handler clearly said this at the time. We assume he meant the sort of establishment, that he was going against the main narrative. Now, I've got a picture of Ari Handler at Gwych Castle when he got married in 1940. So what am I trying to do with this talk? What am I going to try and tell you? Well, I'm arguing that there's no way we could have had this particular view of the Kindertransport, this particular view of how this Hachshrah was organized, this particular view that the Kindertransport was just a scheme he used, if we had had no testimony by Ari Handler. Testimony is important to engage with a wider audience. As I said, people like story, but testimony is also a source for diverse experiences and diverse views, which we can't have any other way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Our next speaker is Professor Dan Stone. Dan is Professor of Modern History and Director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway University of London, and his talk is titled Writing the History of the Holocaust with the International Tracing Service Archive, Understanding Post-War Testimonies.
Thank you, Shirley, and thank you very much to the AJR for organizing this conference and for inviting me. I want to follow on some of the comments made by Barbara and Christine and several of the other speakers earlier, and simply to raise the question as to what it is that we consider to be a testimony. We've heard a lot, and the main focus of the conference is on oral, videoed testimonies, but the word testimony, I think in its origins, tends to connote legal testimony, a statement given for the courtroom, it's often the case that testimonies are incorporated into writing in the way that Eva Reichmann's project demonstrates, and that's something that I want to talk about now by looking at the archives of the International Tracing Service. Some of you may have come across the ITS. It was set up by the Allies at the end of the war as a tracing service to help people find their missing loved ones. And it has a complicated institutional history that I won't bore you with now, but as of 1955, it was administered by the International Committee of the Red Cross until 2007, when, after considerable public pressure, the Red Cross was finally forced to open the archive for public use. Prior to that, very few researchers had ever got inside it, and the people running ITS said that there was very little in there of interest to historians or other scholars. It was basically simply a tracing service. Turns out that there are, in fact, over 30 million documents in there. I'm not going to talk about 1.5 million documents per minute for the next 20 minutes, so I'm going to do a very basic overview. The records there are, amongst others, original records from many of the concentration camps in Germany, registration records, death records, etc., records of the post-war period, the liberation, the displaced persons camps, the work of the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and then the International Refugee Organization to help people be repatriated or resettled after the war. And I'll show you nope. Oh, maybe I don't have a picture of it. That one will do. But there are also over 3 million so-called tracing and documentation files on people that the tracing service was meant to be looking for. So every time from the end of the war up until the present day, somebody sends in a request looking for a missing loved one, the ITS opens a file on that person, and some of these files, most of them are slim by necessity because there's no information, people are dead, but some of them are enormous. There are over 3 million of them, and to see them in the flesh is simply breathtaking. And what you're looking at here is a very small section of the backbone of the ITS, which is the central name index. Originally on cards, there are the names of over 17.5 million people recorded on these cards. So obviously not only Jewish victims of the Holocaust, but all victims of Nazi persecution across the whole of Nazi-occupied Europe. The archive is now almost entirely digitized, and the British copy of it can be accessed at the Wiener Holocaust Library. It's not straightforward to use, but I'm sure it's of immense value to many people for all sorts of reasons, including genealogical research. But what I want to focus on here, I'm just going to grab out a couple of examples from the archive of things in there that we might consider testimonies, and think about what they can be used for and why. This is simply a mural that was on the wall in the lobby of the ITS in Bad Arolsen, which is there were 4 of them, and they've since been lost somewhere, which seems to me a bit implausible, but I still don't know where they are. And the ITS also has a small collection of items that belongs to former inmates, mostly from Neuengamme and Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen, I think. And they have this project called Stolen Memory, trying to return items to descendants of former camp inmates, which is quite interesting. So I just want to give you 3 examples of things that I found in this archive that speak to the question of what is testimony. The first one comes from a journal called Polish Jew, or Polnische Żyd. There were lots of sources of information about the unfolding murder of the Jews available during the war, not least the collection of reports that was gathered by Jakob Appenschlag, co-founder in Warsaw in 1923 of the leading Jewish newspaper Nasz Przegląd, Our Review, and director of the World Jewish Congress's Relief Arm, which was subsequently published as the Black Book of Polish Jewry. And there were lots of reports of this sort picked up in the press in Britain, and one such was this paper called Polish Jew, or Polish Żyd, which was published in both English and Yiddish, but not in Polish, by the American Federation for Polish Jews in New York City. In 1969, the ITS acquired copies of this journal, the originals of which are in YIVO in New York. And I want to mention it because, as far as I know, maybe Joanna knows better, no scholars have written about this journal. I can't find any references to it in the literature that I've looked at. So it's quite intriguing to know why there are copies of it in ITS. A lot of the material in ITS is copied from the Central Office for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes in Ludwigsburg, and I suspect that's where this came from as well. So, just to give one example, that's I used that image just so you could see what the paper looked like. This is from an article about Majdanek, but in what must count as one of the very first published accounts of the death camp Treblinka, appearing in Polish Jew just before the camp was closed, an article called The Treblinka Slaughterhouse offered grim reading in its August 1943 issue. So this was published in New York, this article about Treblinka. On the road between Warsaw and Białystok, in the vicinity of the main railway line, there is a small village by the name of Treblinka. Near that village, the Germans, with the fiendish ingenuity for which they are noted, have built a huge slaughterhouse, which is operated as a well-organized factory and even has a railway connection with the main line. From 5,000 to 6,000 Jews daily are being executed there. The victims are Jewish men, women, and children from Poland and from other occupied countries such as Holland, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, Belgium, and Norway. The article then describes the killing process from the arrival of the transports to the burial of the bodies, sparing none of the gruesome details. This report was then followed up by a second, a few months later, by, quote, a prominent Łódź Jew, well known in the Zionist movement, who escaped from Poland in February 1943 and wrote his account somewhere in occupied Europe, as they said, before it reached a neutral country at the end of September and was then forwarded to Jewish labor leaders in Palestine. The report, and this is interesting for our context, the report was described by the journal's editor as the best eyewitness account of the horrors of Treblinka, the Polish city of death, where hundreds of Jews from all occupied Europe are reported to have been executed in gas chambers in accordance with Hitler's plans for the extermination of all Jews within its borders. The author, deported to Treblinka in September 1942, saved himself by mingling with the work Jews in the camp, the small number of what he called the derelict, half-mad individuals who were directing the Jews along the corridor, the Schlauch, from the undressing area to the gas chamber. After 4 days at Treblinka, during which time Jews from Holland, France, Vienna, and Poland were brought to the camp and murdered, the author escaped by hiding in a pile of clothing and, after nightfall, creeping out and digging under the barbed wire fences that surrounded the camp. After several failed attempts, the author made it to an unnamed neighboring country in February 1943. The vague nature of the report, the anonymity of the author, and the report's convoluted passage to the US lend it both its authenticity and a sense of the journal's urgency. And in that sense, it's very much like an oral testimony, I think, in that all testimonies are mediated, and here the kind of uncertainty surrounding the production of this report lends it a certain similarity to a kind of to a video testimony as well, where you wonder, you don't always know whether what's being stated can be factually corroborated, but it has a kind of ring of authenticity about it. What's, I think, striking finally about this report is, of course, that when it was published, it may have been one of the first reports about Treblinka ever published, but it was inevitably out of date by the time it appeared in print. It wouldn't be much longer before the camp was dismantled. The next example I want to give you, if this works, next. Yep, is about this man Otto Wolken, who was born to Jewish parents in Vienna in 1903, studied medicine and became a doctor. After the annexation of Austria in 1938, he was immediately arrested and sent to a number of prisons and concentration camps before finally being transported to Auschwitz in May 1943. In July of that year, he was saved from a selection for the gas chambers in Birkenau with the help of a friend with connections in the political department in the camp, and he became an inmate doctor, or Häftlingsarzt, in the so-called quarantine camp in section B2A in Birkenau. There, Vulcan had to provide the SS with daily, weekly, quarterly, and yearly lists of inmates transferred to the quarantine camp, which allowed him also to make lists for himself, calculating how many people in each transport were sent immediately to the gas chambers. His rescue of an 11-year-old Italian boy, Luigi Ferri, who he hid for 2 months in different barracks until he was able to persuade a capo to have him registered, is perhaps his most celebrated act of courage from this period. In November 1944, he was transferred to a different section of the camp, but continued to work as a doctor. When the SS started destroying documents before evacuating the camp, Vulcan saved some of the lists and other notes he'd drawn up by hiding them in a tin, which he buried by the doorposts of his block. And this is important because these lists and these things, these reports that he wrote, then formed the basis of his later testimony. So after the liberation of the camp, he was able to use his notes to write a chronicle, which was used in June 1945 by the Polish War Crimes Commission, before which he testified in April 1945, in the Krakow Auschwitz trial of 1947, in the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, and in the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial of 1963 to 65, where he was the first witness to testify, doing so over 2 days. So here you see, if you like, the production of testimony, where his written notes that he had to draw up initially as perpetrator documents for the SS are then transformed into his own notes for his chronicle, and there are several written versions of his time in Birkenau that have subsequently been found, and which were then transformed into legal testimony given in the courtroom on 4 separate occasions in the post-war period. So Vulcan, you see him in the center of the picture there. His testimony at Frankfurt was based on his notes made in the camp and his immediate post-war chronicle. Among the documents that made up that chronicle is one entitled Lagerbilder, or Images of the Camp. This piece, a part of the testimony provided in Krakow, is worth highlighting because it offers a panoramic view of the camp from the point of view of its victims, and because its forensic tone and clinically compiled statistics are coupled with descriptions of horror. The juxtaposition makes the chronicle an outstanding eyewitness account. The ITS archive is full of documents testifying to the organization of the camp system, as well as many accounts provided after the war by former camp inmates in all of the major camps and sub-camps administered by the SS in the Reich. Has less on the Reinhard camps and camps outside of Germany proper, but fewer as powerful as Vulcan's. As a doctor, he was in a position that allowed him to make notes on what he saw, yet he was still an inmate of the camp and was himself subjected to constant suffering. He was in an excellent position to take stock of the everyday brutality of the camp, as well as to understand its place in the Nazis' program for the racial reorganization of Europe. And his words also testify to something else that Andrea was just talking about, the victims' experiences and the emotional trials that they went through. He's modest in his words, but his actions as a doctor, being forced to practice without rudimentary tools of the trade, were brave and humanitarian. So let me just give one example. In one of the versions of the statement delivered in Krakow, Vulcan describes the selection process whereby men in the quarantine camp were deemed unfit to remain in the camp. These selections were carried out by the SS doctors Helmerson, Thilo, König, and Mengele, and transpired, according to Vulcan, as follows. All inmates had to present themselves in rows of 5 in front of the blocks. The doctor proceeded along the rows and sought out people who, for whatever reason, he did not like. I have no other explanation for the basis on which they were selected. It sufficed for someone to be bandaged or to have a bloody sore to fall victim to the selection. From the way in which the selections were carried out, one can see that it was not unusual for the doctor to examine about 500 people within a quarter of an hour. Reporting that following such selections, the victims were held for a day or two in only their shirts to prevent escape attempts and were then transported to their deaths in trucks, accompanied by beatings by guards, Vulcan makes an important observation about those involved. Quote, nevertheless, in order to save the honor of the human race, it should not remain unmentioned that before each such operation, the SS men were only really made ready for action through large alcohol rations. And that use of alcohol as part of the Holocaust is something that I think is so ubiquitous as to have been almost entirely ignored by historians, with a few recent exceptions. So Ed Westerman's recent book on the subject is, I think, the major exception. Vulcan was a powerful and reliable chronicler of the social life in and organization of Auschwitz, especially of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And his words help us to understand the all-pervasive fear and terror that dominated the lives of the inmates, most of whom, when they were not killed on arrival, spent a hellish few months in the camp waiting for death. And one final example concerns the subcamp Auschwitz III, Auschwitz-Monowitz, the Buna camp, which was the administrative headquarters of the Auschwitz subcamp system. And I think not as well known as it should be, considering its importance in the Holocaust. I put this document up there not so that you could read it, but to show you how hard it is to read the documents in ITS. A lot of them are like this. This one is in German. And it takes time to read through these things, and they're often pretty tough going. But I wanted to mention a couple of the post-war testimonies that were provided by former inmates of Auschwitz-Monowitz to the US war crimes investigating teams as well, because these are also forms of testimony that are, of course, different from oral testimonies, but that speak to the question of our changing understanding over time of what a testimony is, what a testimony is for, and who gives it and when. So I won't bore you also with the history of Monowitz, but just to say that by the summer of 1944, there were 11,000 inmates at Monowitz, mostly Hungarian Jews, but also Jews from other European countries, as well as a small number of Roma. Almost all of them were men, with the exception of 10 to 20 women who became forced sex workers. The camp commandant, Heinrich Schwarz, was an important man, not just because he remained in his post until the camp was evacuated at the start of 1945, when he became commandant of Natzweiler, but because, as of 22nd of November 1943, Monowitz was designated the main administrative headquarters for all of the Auschwitz subcamps. The inmates worked either in the IG Farben factory or were subcontracted to other companies working mostly in construction or in methanol production, some details of which were extremely brutal and dangerous. 3 minutes, perfect. Only as of 1944 were inmates put to work in specialized details such as chemical laboratories, with Primo Levi being the most famous. So, how do we know anything about Monowitz? And this is one of the prime ways that we know, these testimonies that we can find in ITS by survivors of the camp. So this one by Robert Elie Weitz, a captured member of the French resistance in the Auvergne, one of about 1,200 Frenchmen who were deported to Auschwitz in 1943, was among a group of about 230 men who were immediately sent on to Monowitz. After the war, when he became the president of the Amicale d'Auschwitz, a French survivors organization, he testified about his experiences there. The first striking thing that Weitz claimed was that, quote, he quickly realized that Monowitz was an extermination camp, and he uses the German term Vernichtungslager, not in the sense of Birkenau, where people were gassed, but in the sense that the strenuous work led to the decline of their physical and psychic defenses, and I quote him again, whose conclusion was, for most, the gas chamber. So Monowitz was not a camp where people were led immediately to be killed. Rather, once they became too weak to work, they would then be taken to Birkenau and killed there. The goal, as Weitz put it, was unequivocally clear: the total exhaustion and finally the annihilation of the hard-worked IG Auschwitz inmates. Indeed, he claimed to have heard an SS officer say to the Monowitz inmates, "You are all sentenced to death. The carrying out of your sentence is just being extended a little." Let me give one more example. And I'll come to that in a second. The so-called hospital in Monowitz exemplifies the absurdity of the slave labor operation. With no regard for the inmates' health, it seems surprising that a hospital existed at all. Yet we know that this institution, a mockery of a real hospital, existed in most Nazi concentration camps. Berthold Epstein, formerly professor of pediatrics in Prague, and a nurse, or Pfleger, in Monowitz, explained after the war the various illnesses that resulted from the awful conditions and the relentless work, accompanied by beatings, poor food, and inadequate clothing. Pneumonia, inflammations, blood poisoning, hunger, edema, and extreme emaciation, as well as many cases of work-related injuries caused by falling machinery and raw material and a lack of protective clothing, and so on. Epstein and his colleagues did what they could, but their appointment as doctors was also a mockery, for they were not supplied with any of the necessary equipment, medicine, or sanitary facilities to heal the sick and injured. IG Farben also sponsored medical experiments, and SS Dr. Helmut Vetter, who was commissioned by his former employer, Farben, to test drugs on inmates at Dachau and Mauthausen, did the same at Monowitz. Monowitz was evacuated on the 18th of January 1945, when some 10,000 inmates were sent on the death march, leaving behind between 800 and 850 who were considered too ill to walk. Those evacuated walked west as far as Gliwice, where they were placed in cattle trucks and transported to concentration camps further west, many of them to Mittelbau-Dora, the center for underground V2 rocket production. One inmate, and this is the testimony you see here, Jankel Leff, testified to a Yiddish-speaking captain from the US War Crimes investigating team at Nordhausen, one of the subcamps of Mittelbau, on the 2nd of May 1945. He described his evacuation to the Birke Kaserne at Nordhausen at the start of May. This is what you see here. When I was transferred from the concentration camp at Monowitz, Poland, to Birke Kaserne at Nordhausen, Germany, I traveled with many other prisoners on a railway transport. On this transport, I saw an SS man shoot 2 prisoners. The SS man, Unterscharführer Kraus, got drunk on the train and told the prisoners who were packed in open boxcars to raise 2 of their number above their heads. He then drew his revolver and shot them. Unterscharführer Kraus can be readily recognized because all the fingers of his right hand are missing and he fires his weapon with his left hand. That is the sort of detail that one does not find in a perpetrator document. That is the basis of post-war Holocaust testimonies. There are many such moments that we find in oral testimonies as well and video testimonies. But when we go back to the post-war period and look at the first testimonies given for war crimes commissions and other historical commissions and so on, we see something that historians, as a few of us have already said, have started to realize that without using these testimonies, we're missing out on a huge amount of experience that does not appear in the documents produced by the Nazis. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And I should note that Dan has a book forthcoming on the ITS later this year with Oxford University Press. Our final speaker in this panel is Tony Kushner. Tony is professor at the Parks Institute for the Study of Jewish and Non-Jewish Relations and the History Department at the University of Southampton. And the intriguing question that he has posed to us in his paper title is Holocaust Testimony, Given or Taken?
Thank you, Shirley. And those of you that know the buildings of the University of Southampton, it's home to home here. It's, or not. The practice and theory of oral history has become increasingly reflexive. Initially, there was a perhaps naive assumption that the archive created by oral history would provide evidence about the past that was absent from record repositories, and thereby rescuing from oblivion the experiences of the marginalized and oppressed in history. Initial attacks on oral history because of the alleged unreliability of the material gathered through the processes of memory distortion was countered by those practicing it by large-scale projects where the mass of evidence was seen as a way of ensuring reliability. But in later, more self-confident mode, what was seen as weaknesses by traditional historians were now regarded by practitioners of oral history as an additional strength, the role of mythology, silences, and distortions in the construction of testimony. Taken together, oral historians would now argue that both the detail and the myth are seen as essential in understanding the identities of those interviewed, reflecting both the then and the now, and the relationship between the two in understanding the multi-layered and dynamic processes involved in understanding any individual. And linked to the less defensive approach to oral evidence is a growing awareness that the power relations and the gathering of testimony also needs to be recognized. The democratic and social justice seal of recovering lost voices has given way to angst about who owns the life stories collected, what use they are put to, and whether the interviewee is left empowered or alienated, especially if the interviewers are from the world of higher education or linked to the elite world of major cultural institutions. Indeed, the potential tension over ownership has come out recently in how the Grenfell Tower fire disaster is sort of a bonfire of regulations being destroyed, when over 70 people, mainly of migrant origin, burned to death. And the question of ownership comes up in terms of who should be represented and remembered, how it should be represented and remembered. With a BBC series and a National Theatre production imminent on the disaster, based on the testimonies of those who came out of the fire alive, one of the survivors of the fire, Mariam Adam, and the youngest survivor, her daughter, asked, I quote, "Who are they talking to? Who gives them permission to do these things and then tell us after? Before you do this sort of thing, you should get our permission, because this is our pain, our story." I've worked on refugee and Holocaust survivor testimony at both a practical level, carrying out interviews, academic writing, involved in exhibitions, and more theoretically, especially about how such voices are represented in museums, popular culture, and historiography for close to 4 decades now. What is still a little frustrating is that the increasingly sophisticated and reflexive work on oral history and life story narratives of ordinary people has perhaps not sufficiently been engaged with by those dealing with the testimonies of those who experienced persecution during the Third Reich. There are important exceptions, the most significant of which, I would argue, is the work of Hank Greenspan. I'll return to Hank shortly. Before then, it is necessary to highlight the broad stages through which the gathering of Holocaust testimony has gone through, neatly summarized by the French cultural scholar Annette Vivorca, who we've heard from earlier today. In the first decades after the war, she notes, testimony was given spontaneously and solicited by the needs of justice, and that follows from what Dan was just outlining. Under what she believed was the influence of the Americanization of the Holocaust in the later 20th century and beyond, this was, she says, succeeded by the social imperative of memory. The survivor was now supposed to honor a duty to remember, which could not be morally be evaded. And what follows is a generalization. Some testimony projects, such as the Yale University Fortunoff Archive, which we've heard a lot of this morning, came initially from survivor initiatives and remain to this day collaborative ventures. In contrast, and again this is generalizing, that at the United States Memorial Museum and the Visual History Archive are very much top-down projects justified by that duty to remember, whatever the survivor's own emotional standpoint in contributing to such projects. The situation in the UK is perhaps more nuanced and harder to categorize. The first major projects were in Manchester and London. That coming out of the Manchester Jewish Museum in the 1980s was more community-focused and applied a life story approach, reflecting the fact that those carrying out the interviews were at the forefront of the oral history movement in the UK. They thus wanted to explore experiences both before and after the years of persecution in the interview process. And we've heard earlier how the Wiener Library project sort of ended abruptly in 1945, as did that in Yad Vashem. That of the Imperial War Museum a few years earlier, in their pioneering Britain and the refugee crisis, the very first formal oral history project was narrower, focusing largely on alien internment. And the restraints imposed clearly frustrated many of those interviewed. Overall, it was a case more of taken than given testimony with little or no sense of partnership. The British Library National Life Story Project from the 1990s was somewhere in the middle, with a strong personnel connection to Manchester amongst the interviewers, but an unevenness in the quality of the interviews, sometimes reflecting a lack of knowledge, which reflected a lack of engagement in the UK as a whole at that point in the late 80s, early 90s. The AJR's Refugee Voices, which we've heard so much about, which covers those that came during the 1930s and a smaller number of survivors after the war, is now the largest broadly defined Holocaust testimony project in the UK, and is more in the community model, as we've heard, funded and organised by the Association of Jewish Refugees. Its richness, I would argue, comes from the many different identities and experiences emerging from the video interviews, again through the use of a life story approach. In all these varying post-1980s projects in the USA and the UK, it reflects the pattern outlined by Vivorka, but it's also a desire to carry out as many interviews as possible, and that's very noticeable. It's an understandable desire to carry out what I've called a form of rescue archaeology, and an increasingly strong imperative to capture on tape or film the voices of refugees and survivors before that generation pass away. This is most marked by the largest, perhaps most problematic archive, that of the Visual History Archive. Earlier, the Shoah Foundation, which now totals some around 60,000 video recordings with survivors. This is the largest collection on any historical episode in history. And that is remarkable in itself. And it includes non-Jewish victims of the Nazis and those from earlier and later genocides. Mention of the Visual History Archive project is a good point to bring in the work of Hank Greenspan. Struggling to define his approach to Holocaust testimony, the latter word I should add, and this follows, I think, from some of the discussion already today, it's a word testimony that Hank rejects because of its legalistic, final, and sometimes involuntary connotations. We're trying to define his approach. A colleague came to his rescue at a conference in the later 1990s. She said of his work, the Shoah Foundation wants to interview 50,000 different survivors once. Hank wants to interview the same survivor 50,000 times. But if not 50,000 times, Hank's work on listening to survivors, published in 1998 and then again in extended form 2010, explores conversations with a small number of individuals, and also his co-produced book with Slovakian survivor Aji Rubin, Reflections, Auschwitz Memory and a Life Recreated, which he describes as a book of memories, but is equally a book about memory. And again, all of those works reflect multiple conversations over many decades. They are, I would argue, truly self-reflexive partnerships, and I think this is a key word, with the Holocaust survivors, about how and what they remember, and the changing shape of memories over a long time frame. It is what Hank describes as knowing with a survivor, and thus addressing head-on the question of ownership and power relations in the interview process. The question of whether it is right to interview all refugees from Nazism and Holocaust survivors is now sadly becoming redundant, as we are very, very aware, acutely aware, as that generation inevitably passes on. What we can do, however, is explore what Noah Schenker has called reframing Holocaust testimony, contextualizing the dynamics of each project in time, place, and organizational structure, and seeing how this impacts on the survivor voice. I want to explore this briefly with regard to one particular survivor, Vera Karoli, who I knew well for over a decade before her death in 2003. Vera came from a privileged and assimilated Slovak Jewish family where tragedy had struck well before her deportation to Auschwitz and eventual liberation in Belsen. Her mother had committed suicide when Vera was just 2. Vera did not want to talk about her experiences, or rather she did so only briefly and on her own terms. For several years she was hounded by the Shoah Foundation to give her testimony. Eventually, it proved easier to give in to their requests, and Vera is recorded in 1997. The 90 minutes of the interview act almost as a form of counter-memorial, with Vera refusing to provide anything other than factual responses, and even then relying to some extent on the information she had garnered from the International Tracing Service in the mid-1950s, and which she had on her lap. Vera was also grimly determined not to cry, as she realised this was performatively expected of her, with a box of tissues put at the ready for this purpose. The questioning was crass. When asked of her impressions of Auschwitz, she replied, "What do you think?" And on Belsen, "It was horrendous, what can I tell you? Use your imagination." Her resistance to being interviewed comes to a climax when asked in true Shoah Foundation redemptive manner to give her message for future generations. Vera shouts at the interviewer that nobody cares and nobody can understand what I've been through. When she whispers, it's very large stage whispers, that she's had enough, the interviewer attempts a token closure. "Vera, thank you." Not to be outwitted, Vera has the last word. Oh, thank goodness for that. In Vera's case, she was able to describe her life experiences, but very much with her in control. A few years earlier, from the formal video interview, she talked to David Southampton, a Reform rabbi and a child of survivors hiding in Amsterdam. There was a mutual empathy between the two, and David wrote up his meeting with Vera, where she recounted her life story. Even deeper into her emotional history were her paintings. Trained later in life at Southampton School of Art, Vera's abstracts reflect both her days in the camps and what she referred to as her life beyond. Her most famous painting we see here, After Auschwitz, reflected the life, however troubled, she created after liberation. Her death notice in the Jewish Chronicle reads, Shoah survivor, linguist, artist, musician, bridge master, and gardener. Her 12 months in the camp shaped her mentally and physically, but they did not by any means totally define her. What then to do with the mountains of refugee and survivor testimony we've gathered, especially since the 1980s? And I had guesstimated a figure of 100,000, but from there, it now seems a more reliable figure is 115,000 accounts, which is truly astonishing. From the dismissive comments of the early historians of the Holocaust, such as Gerald Reitlanger, who rejected using the testimony of the hardy survivors because, as he said, they were seldom educated men, we've moved to a new consensus, marked first by Saul Friedlander in his 2-volume History of the Holocaust in 1997 and 2007, where he highlighted how victim voices are, I quote, essential if we are to attain an understanding of the past. Friedlander thus aimed with regard to testimony to provide both an integrative and integrated history. Likewise, David Cesaroni's posthumous Final Solution, 2016, also sought an integrated history. Both outstanding scholars incorporated the words of contemporary Jews, especially diarists whose work have exceptional literary as well as historical significance. They both show the variety of Jewish responses, reflecting different ideologies, places, and times in the destruction process. Both largely avoid post-war accounts and interviews, and David Cesaroni was especially skeptical of these, suggesting that Holocaust testimony is largely responsible for the gulf between academic scholarship and popular understanding because of its sheer emotional power. And it is these voices that will dominate our understanding, and you could argue quite rightly so. The incorporation of contemporary Jewish voices serves, in Christopher Browning's words, a disruptive function, queering the camouflage language of the Nazis and making human those who were regarded like the victims of transatlantic slavery before them as pieces or cargo by the perpetrators. And yet, to conclude, I wonder how far we have really moved from the dismissive words of the early work of Gerald Reitlanger, or those of his French equivalent, Leon Poliakov, who in his Harvest of Hate, to forestall objections, he said, quoted the executioners rather than the victims. I would argue that rather than confine ourselves to the most rightly and brilliant of say, ghetto diarists, and to ignore the huge amount of Holocaust testimony produced after 1945, is to try to manage to contain the Holocaust and to limit its disruptive potential. We aim, understandably, for a clear chronology, but that can only be achieved by letting the perpetrators set the narrative. As Lawrence Langer, another scholar of testimony, especially the Yale project, suggests the Holocaust had a different beginning for every victim. To put testimony to the forefront and to explore the context in which it was created, in some cases taken and some cases given, is to take risks, but ones, if we are to do justice to its millions of victims, is a necessary, though a huge challenge to historians, curators, filmmakers and the like. We need, finally returning to Hank Greenspan, to continue, even after they have passed away, the process of knowing with the testimony of survivors and return to the art of listening. Why is this so important? For the sufficient reason, as Hank concludes, to listen to survivors is to listen to survivors. No other purpose is required. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tony. And now, because our speakers have been so good about keeping to time, we have a full 15 minutes for your questions and comments. Who would like to start us off? Yes, please. I'm not sure if they are roving mics.
I will try and speak up.
There's one. It's here in the front. We need it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, all of you, for really interesting papers. My question is actually to Tony. Hank was a member of our network, and he performed his one-man play, Remnants, which is performing on the testimonies of the people that he's interviewed, not quite 50,000 times, but many, many times. And it was quite controversial within the context of the network, because there was a sense that he was taking testimony rather than giving it. It's not necessarily a view that I would take, but I wondered how you felt that his kind of move towards theatre, which he's done a number of things with it, meshes with his scholarship as a historian.
It's interesting. Hank is one of these disgraceful people. Hank is a psychologist, dramatist and scholar. It's bad enough being good at one thing, but three is just not too much. I think he would see it as one, that there is a performative element to his academic writing, where constantly there is a dialogue between himself, the survivors looking back at their testimony, remembering new things, remembering things they remembered before, but in a different way. Sometimes aided by documents they wrote immediately after the war. And so I think his work is essentially saying that this testimony is never finished, and that I haven't seen his play, I have to say, but I should imagine it is continuing a dialogue, and again, against any sense of closure in his work, and that theatre is another way of achieving that. And not restoring, but continuing the individuality, messiness, complexity of the individual. So I think he would be very unhappy if he felt that he was taking, because I think he would see himself as sharing what people have shared with him.
That's certainly how I viewed it, but yeah, that was controversial within the discussion at the network.
Yes, please.
Thank you for your very interesting presentations. As a visual artist, I wonder if any of you have got any thoughts on the importance of visual documentation of drawings, of paintings, of films, of other visual forms of testimony that have come out of the Holocaust, which we've only been talking really about writing and audio-visual documentation.
It's obviously a very large topic, and I don't propose to start a conversation generally about Holocaust art, and of which we could easily talk about for ages. But I would just say that in the ITS archives, there are some remarkable drawings, maps, sketches, drawings, that some of which I've included in my book on the subject. In particular, at the end of the war, the occupation authorities in Germany instructed the newly installed Bürgermeister, or mayors of every locality in Germany, to provide details of where United Nations citizens, non-Germans, had died during the death marches in their vicinity. And the cemetery maps that they sent back are really remarkable. Some of them are proper architectural drawings, but some of them are paintings, some of them are sketches, and they contain all sorts of bizarre details that have no relevance, ostensibly, to the thing that they're supposed to be doing. So you can see that they act as kind of comments on the state of things in post-war Germany at that time. There are also, and I would call them testimonies, there are sketches by survivors of subcamps, for example, some of the subcamps of Gross Rosen, who's like Friedland or Reichenau, names that have really have been forgotten in the English-speaking world, and they're among the very few documents that we have pertaining to those camps at all. And they're extremely basic as sketches, but they're something, and they do provide a visualization of what could otherwise be said in words. So it's different, of course, from abstract art or all sorts of other forms of artistic responses to the Holocaust, but as a form of what we might call visual testimony, they're extremely effective.
Yeah, I was thinking about, there is a book of drawings from the West Wall, which has a drawing of my late uncle, who was brought me to Aberystwyth in it. And the West Wall is one of the has very detailed visual testimony, both in drawings and film.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you. I would just add, actually, that there's also a scholar in the United States, Eliana Adler, who's been doing some really interesting work on the hand-drawn maps in the Yiskirbicher, the memorial books, the Yiddish memorial books that people created of their hometowns, and she's thinking about them very much as visual testimonies. Joanna.
Thank you, Shirli. Discussing the issue of late post-war testimonies, of course, this is a very complex topic, and Saul Friedlander would never use them. And yet Omer Bartov, in his acclaimed book on Butchert, he incorporates the late post-war testimonies. Now, we have the problem of external contingencies that we actually, when it comes to these late post-war testimonies, especially collected by these big organizations, as the Shoah Foundation. And there are major problems. And at this moment in history, as historians, we are actually unpacking them. And the whole issue when we deal with these testimonies is the issue of unpacking, understanding the narratives of redemption, the smoothing narratives, the talking over the survivors. And of course, this is, from an oral history methodologist, this is only one testimony, and one should expect a chain of those in sense to gain a fuller picture of the person who is interviewed. But at this point, actually, we are actually looking at the external contingencies as one of the chief weaknesses. There is a big subject about sexual barter, sexual abuse of Holocaust survivors. In those testimonies, the interviewers would steer the interview from these topics. And you actually capture this because this is a videotape testimonies. And there are other subjects pertaining to difficult issues. And of course, being with listening to survivor is also another concept introduced by a French scholar in groupness, searching some kind of a relation that one is the good listener and doesn't impose any cultural, also national narratives. We know that some survivors in particular contexts censor themselves in order to fit the narratives that are the key narratives in the media. So if you could all comment on that.
Would anyone like to answer that? Or
it would be very interesting if the world is still here in 20, 30 years to see what a Holocaust museum would look like. If the shift is going towards the experience of it, and I think the Imperial War Museum, I would say this because I was involved in the historical team that Dan oversaw, that it's using testimony in a more complex way, but it is not reversing the chronology in terms of survivor-led or victim-led. What a victim-led museum would look like is very, very hard to conceive, because I think we are moving, less is more. We're looking at small, if we're fortunate position of having the same person interviewed by different projects, that allows that, or at different times in their lives. And with Vera, who I mentioned, it's the artwork, I think, that gets you closer to her inner self, and I'm fortunate to know her very well. But how that impacts on representation and goes beyond the illustrative, I think is a real challenge in historiography, in museums and beyond, which we haven't, we've got this material now, and what we do with it is mind-blowing.
please, Malcolm.
Yes, I just had a question. All of you have mentioned testimony as testimony sort of in legal terms, in other words, that it is having some function. And that, so I was just wondering whether an oral history or a life history has an element of some sort of higher court, that there is a sort of, it's not as if it's being taken, that it's being given in a sort of more abstract construct, that that the life story becomes, part of some universal archive, as it were. But can you say something about whether, because the implication, I was just thinking about Professor Kushner, what you were saying, the implication that there's a sort of a race to take testimony is implying that it's coming from the outside. And you mentioned top down, but isn't that very important to have a sort of a framework within which, at this point, the testimony can be given?
Thank you. We have 2 more questions and about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to let the 2 additional questioners ask their questions and then leave it to the panel to give extremely brief responses. And if I could please ask the questioners to keep it as brief as possible. Thank you.
Hello, I'll be very brief in my question. As historians, what do you feel is the direction of travel? So there are a lot of different kinds of projects you can do with survivor testimony, but projects that are really about history and representing the past. What is the direction of travel as far as testimony as a reliable source with proper work, or testimony, as David Cesarini says, as responsible for the divisions between kind of public misperceptions and academic work?
The gentleman in front of you as well was going to ask.
I'm sort of going back to the question about cartography. In 1967, my adoptive father was called to go to Stuttgart for the Janowska Street trial. And he happened to see what was happening in Janowska because he was sitting with the horses in the, what do you call it, stable, yeah? And looking through the window, but he couldn't remember various details where the stables were, etc. So he spent hours and hours sitting and drawing exactly where the things were in Janowska camp. And the Israeli police was actually directing him, and as it happens, from the memory that he reconstructed in 1967, I can't remember the name of the commandant of the camp, got a German sentence, sort of probably 5 years or something. So how a post-fact, 20 years, 30 years later, testimony is valued by historians, because we know how the courts reacted.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have to be very brief, but I think Malcolm's question is really interesting because I do think it's very important, obviously, to have the survivors, they have agency and they want to give testimony. And that is something we do also have to enable. And how we then investigate it, I think the direction of travel is to accept the testimony, to incorporate it in our academic work, but at the same time, like one of the questioners at the front row said, you know, it is our job as academics, obviously, to question as well.
Thanks again. Briefly, and this is not just to compliment the organisers or the sponsoring body, but I think the AJR project is something that's come out of an organisation. When Bayer said that, you know, the people who are queuing to sort of want to be interviewed, that is a very healthy sign, and that suggests a partnership and a shared thing. But at the same time, there's a critical approach to the professional approach to the testimony. So I think it's a good model, and it's also not got a sort of a very clear sort of agenda that you will give your testimony in this way with this ideology. There is a real richness of different approaches in it. Obviously, very earlier people who came to the UK are not recorded, and that's in that particular one, and that's nothing we can do about it. I think in terms of direction of travel is very much in Holocaust studies, and not just in that field, towards looking at the victim side of things, the variation in experiences. And as someone that's sort of trained in sort of history workshop style history from below, trying to sort of value not just the wonderful ghetto diarists or the Primo Levis and Elie Wiesels, but ordinary people whose work is still, you know, whether it be written or given in form of testimony, oral testimony, video testimony, it's still shaped. And to look at the narrative strategies that people put, it's to take it seriously, it's not to queer it, but to actually value it even more. So I think that's something that I hope can be done. So that means that division between the elite writers of the Holocaust and the ordinary writers and their ordinary testimony, I think is queried.
Well, just to say quickly, I mean, I think that Holocaust historiography is much more diverse, methodologically innovative than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And so we have now the diversity of the historians working in Holocaust history is echoed in the ways in which that they write. And so we've had all sorts of, you know, academic fashions, spatial turn and linguistic turn and cultural turn and forensic turn and so on. And I think there will be others to come. I think there's going to be more emphasis on class in the near future, and I think that's something for which Holocaust testimonies will be extremely helpful. And I think there's going to be more interest in religion, as historians have who on the whole, historians tend to be secular, leftist, liberalish, forget the fact that the majority of the victims of the Holocaust were Orthodox Eastern European Jews, and not helped, of course, by the fact that a lot of rabbinic responsa and other writings by religious Jews have been largely inaccessible for linguistic or institutional reasons. So I think that's going to change. I mean, I basically agree with Tony, but I would say I think in writing the history of the Holocaust or any genocide, we can't not write about the perpetrators. I think you can't understand how and why genocide happens without the perpetrators, but the disruptive function of testimonies that Tony talks about as a way of producing a narrative that is not driven or determined by the perpetrators is extremely important. And so I think there's going to be lots more studies along the lines of Barbara and Christine's earlier by historians trying to uncover the history of testimony and particularly the early post-war collection of testimony, and then using that material in order to write the history of the Holocaust differently, i.e. from the point of view of the victims.
Well, thank you, all three of you, again, for a really stimulating and excellent panel.